April 17, 1945. The snow along the Bavarian hills had finally melted into mud, and what was left of the Reich looked less like a nation and more like a ghost drifting through smoke. The fields were dead, the roads bomb-cratered, and the only sound in the valleys was the groan of wagons pulled by thin horses and thinner men. The German army was collapsing by the hour, but for most civilians, the war had already ended, just not the hunger. In a small village north of Nuremberg, there were no men left to speak of. The boys had gone to the front, the old had died defending bridges, and the women had become both soldiers and survivors. Inside one cottage, its roof half caved in from an air raid weeks earlier, a woman named Lotte knelt before a soot-black pot. She stirred what had once been a handful of nettles, mixed with water, pretending it was soup. Her daughter, a pale 7-year-old with hollow cheeks, sat silently by the fire, watching steam rise like ghost. When the girl asked if the soup would taste like bread this time, Lotte smiled without answering. She had learned that lies could be as merciful as food. The air outside was filled with rumors. Some said the Russians were only days away. Others whispered that the Americans were kinder, that they gave chocolate to children in the West. But propaganda still echoed faintly from the broken radios, gravelly voices promising a final victory, urging civilians to resist the barbaric invaders. The words rang absurd in the silence. Resist the barbaric invaders. The words rang absurd in the silence of empty bell towers. For years, the people had been told the Americans were devils who would burn, rape, and destroy. Yet now, when the first sound of engines rolled down the hill, most villagers did not run to fight. They simply watched. From the fog emerged olive-drab trucks, each painted with a white star. The U.S. 45th Infantry Division was advancing, their uniforms coated in road dust, faces weary but alert. These were boys from Oklahoma, Illinois, and New York, barely 20, trained to survive in a foreign world that propaganda had turned into myth. They moved carefully, rifles raised, expecting snipers or booby-trap. What they found instead stopped them cold. Near the town square, once home to a bakery, a dozen women stood in silence. They held infants swaddled in curtains and bedsheets, their eyes wide, their lips gray. Some of the children were barefoot in the cold. The soldiers saw them, then saw the hollow pans they held out, not as weapons but as offerings. The lieutenant hesitated. His orders were clear. Secure the area, search for enemy soldiers, move on. Yet in that moment, discipline collided with instinct. One private reached into his pack and pulled out a tin of Spam. Another took out chocolate from his ration, unwrapping it as if it were gold. The women flinched when he approached. One pulled her child close, whispering, "Gift! Don't eat, it's poison." But then another woman, perhaps too desperate to care, stepped forward. She dipped a spoon into the offered food. Her lips trembled. The soldiers watched her swallow, waiting. Then she began to cry. Not a scream, not a wail, just the sound of years collapsing. The others followed. Within minutes, rations meant for soldiers were spread across the ground. Biscuits, meat, powdered milk, gum. The Americans meat, powdered milk, gum. The Americans crouched and passed food to the children, unsure what to say, some smiling awkwardly, others choking on the sight. A medic named Corporal Hayes later wrote in his notebook, "I thought I was ready for anything after Anzio and Dachau. I wasn't ready for this." They didn't beg. They just stood there, empty, waiting to see if we were human. The village began to stir for the first time in months. Word spread quickly, the Americans are here. From cellars and barns, more civilians appeared, hesitant but drawn by scent and sound. The soldiers noticed that the children had forgotten how to laugh. Even when handed chocolate they stared, uncomprehending. Hayes knelt before one boy, no older than 10, whose hands shook so badly he couldn't hold the spoon. Hayes lifted it for him. When the boy finally ate, a strange expression passed over his face, fear melting into wonder. Then he smiled, a small, hesitant thing that caught in his throat before becoming real. By dusk, the square had turned into a quiet gathering place. Soldiers leaned against their trucks, watching the mothers feed their children. Lotte was there, too, her daughter asleep in her lap, face smeared with crumbs and chocolate. She had not eaten herself. She had given everything to the girl. When one soldier noticed, he pressed his last tin of beans into her hand. She tried to refuse, shaking her head, but he insisted. Their eyes met briefly, hers filled with disbelief, his with a shame he couldn't name. Later that night, as the division prepared to move on, the lieutenant stood looking at the small fires flickering through the ruins. "We came here to end a war," he murmured, "and instead we found the war already ended, for them, at least." The men ate quietly, their own rations halved, their hunger softened by something deeper than pity. They did not speak much, but they knew something irreversible had happened that day. The enemy had changed shape. No longer faceless, no longer monstrous, just human, starving, fragile. In their exhaustion, the soldiers began to feel a strange tenderness for the very people they'd been told to fear. Before dawn, Hayes packed his gear. He kept one item separate. A small wooden toy horse a German child had slipped into his pocket after supper. The child hadn't spoken, just pressed it into his hand and run off. The medic turned the toy over in the dim light, tracing its chipped paint. It was crudely carved, likely by a father now dead or missing. He thought of his own family back home, his mother sending him food he never ate. The world, he realized, had become a mirror, cracked but reflecting the same faces on both sides. Outside, frost crept along the edges of the village wells. The soldiers climbed into their trucks, engines coughing awake. As they rolled out, Lotte stood by the road, her daughter in her arms, wrapped in a borrowed blanket. She raised a hand, not a wave, not a salute, just a silent gesture of gratitude. Hayes lifted his helmet in return. Behind them, the first light touched the roofs of the ruined town, turning the smoke into gold. The sound of the convoy faded down the road, swallowed by the hills. In the quiet that followed, the villagers gathered again near the square, waiting for something they could not yet name. Some stared at the horizon, half expecting the soldiers to return. They didn't know that the story would spread, that across Bavaria, towns just like theirs would soon see the same miracle repeated again and again. For now there was only one question hanging in the cold air, unspoken but heavy in every mother's heart. If the enemy could show such mercy, what else about this war had been a lie? The morning after the soldiers left, the village awoke to silence, an unfamiliar kind of silence. It was no longer the hush of fear, but of hunger holding its breath, waiting for hope to return. The women gathered near the square where the Americans had shared their food. The ground was littered with the remains of that miracle, empty tins, torn ration boxes, scraps of wrappers that the children now treated as treasures. Lotte's daughter, Elsa, clutched one such wrapper between her fingers. It shimmered faintly in the sun, smelling faintly of chocolate. She wouldn't let it go, even as her mother tried to coax her back home. By midday, a column of smoke appeared on the horizon. More trucks. The sound of engines rolled through the valley once again, this time heavier, slower. The villagers froze, torn between dread and desperate anticipation. When the vehicles finally arrived, the white stars on their doors confirmed it. The Americans had returned. But it wasn't the same patrol. These soldiers looked different, more cautious, more organized. They carried boxes marked with stencils, U.S. Army Field Rations, Type C. The new lieutenant, a tall man with a southern accent, dismounted first. He removed his helmet and looked around the shattered village, his face unreadable. A translator accompanied him, a German-American private from Milwaukee named David Klein. When he spoke, the villagers recognized the rhythm of their own language, softened by something gentler. "We've come to bring food," he announced. "But we need order. Everyone will receive something. No one will be left out." The words were simple, but they fell like water on scorched ground. For the first time, people moved without fear. Mothers stepped forward with empty baskets, old men with sacks. The soldiers formed a line and began distributing cans of Spam, powdered milk, and hard biscuits. Lotte waited near the end, her daughter pressed close to her leg. When their turn came, Klein handed them 2 tins and smiled. "Eat slowly," he said, his German halting. "It's rich." Elsa stared at him with wide eyes, her lips trembling as if unsure whether to smile back. Behind the line, a medic, Corporal Hayes again, reassigned to civilian relief duty, watched quietly. He recognized Lotte from the previous day and gave her a small nod. Something in her posture had changed. She stood taller, her eyes clearer. But around her, the scale of suffering was staggering. Dozens of families had walked from nearby villages after hearing rumors that the Americans feed the children. Many had carried their little ones in blankets for miles. Some arrived too late. A few collapsed on the roadside before reaching the square. The soldiers worked until sunset. Hayes and Klein moved among the crowd, checking for the sick. They found a boy no older than 10, barely breathing, his face pale and thin as paper. Hayes knelt, felt the weak pulse, and called for water. The boy's mother explained that he hadn't eaten in 4 days. They had boiled leather straps to trick his stomach. Hayes poured a spoonful of milk mixture into the boy's mouth and whispered, "Easy now, kid, easy." When the child's eyelids fluttered open, his mother fell to her knees, sobbing into the dirt. From that evening onward, the Americans returned daily. The villagers began to call them the angels of bread. They brought not only food but medicines, bandages, and sometimes laughter. Children who once hid behind fences now chased after jeeps, waving. The soldiers started recognizing faces: Elsa's bright hair, old Frau Mendel's cane, the twins who always fought over gum. Hayes began sketching the village in a small notebook, noting names and faces. "So I don't forget," he said when Lotte asked. But beneath the surface, guilt gnawed at everyone. The villagers couldn't look at their own hands without remembering what they had once believed. They had sent their sons to fight these men. They had cheered when victory seemed near. Now, the same enemy held their babies and wiped their tears. The older women murmured that perhaps this was God's punishment, or His forgiveness. Lotte didn't know which. One afternoon, while the soldiers unloaded supplies near the church ruins, Elsa disappeared. Panic spread quickly. Lotte ran through the rubble, shouting her name, her voice echoing off broken walls. Then she heard laughter, a sound she hadn't heard from her daughter in months. Turning the corner, she saw her standing beside Hayes, both kneeling by a stray dog. The soldier had tied a bit of Spam to a string, coaxing the animal closer. Elsa was giggling, eyes alight with life. Lotte froze, overcome by something she couldn't name. Gratitude, perhaps, or grief for how quickly a child could forget fear. That night, Lotte sat by the fire with the same tin Hayes had given her days earlier. She had eaten little herself, saving most for Elsa. When her daughter finally fell asleep, Lotte stared into the flame, listening to the distant rumble of trucks moving toward another front. The war wasn't over yet, but here, in this small corner of ruin, something like peace had already begun. In the following days, more towns sent delegations begging for aid. The soldiers were overwhelmed. Headquarters issued new orders: relief to be coordinated, not improvised. "We're soldiers, not social workers," one officer grumbled. But the men on the ground ignored that line. "Tell command they can court-martial me later," Hayes muttered. "No one starves on my watch." Klein began keeping a diary. In one entry he wrote, "They don't ask for mercy anymore. Just milk for the children. And when we give it, they cry like we've returned their sons from the grave." He noticed something else, too: how the German women had started smiling when they saw the Americans coming, how children ran without hesitation. The fear was evaporating, replaced by something fragile and luminous. By late April, the square had changed. Where there had once been rubble and ash, children now played with wooden toys and army tin lids, pretending they were drums. Lotte helped organize a small kitchen beside the well, teaching the other women how to stretch rations, how to share. The soldiers watched, amused, sometimes joining in. Hayes tried German words. The villagers laughed at his accent. One day, he brought Elsa a bar of soap shaped like a lamb. She held it as though it were made of crystal. Still, shadows lingered. At night, Lotte often dreamed of the air raids, the roar of engines, the fire raining down. In the morning she would wake to the smell of American coffee drifting from the trucks and feel the sting of contradiction. Could the same nation that bombed her home now save her child? She didn't have an answer. But when she saw Elsa running barefoot across the square, clutching her chocolate wrapper like a banner, she decided not to ask any more. On the last day of April, the lieutenant gathered the villagers. "Tomorrow we move north," he said through Klein. "Another town needs us." The announcement fell heavy, though no one protested. They understood that mercy, like food, could never stay forever. As the soldiers packed their supplies, Elsa approached Hayes and held out her precious wrapper. "For you," she whispered in broken English. He smiled, gently refusing. "Keep it," he said. "Remind you that good things happen after bad dreams." That night, as engines idled and lanterns flickered, the villagers stood by the roadside to watch the convoy depart. No one waved at first. It felt too final. But then Elsa lifted her hand, small and trembling. One by one, others followed. Hayes turned once, raised his hand in return, and the trucks rolled into the dark. Long after the sound faded, the people stayed there, listening to the quiet. The square felt empty again, but different, haunted not by fear, but by the echo of kindness. And as dawn began to rise, Lotte whispered to her daughter, "Do you think they'll ever come back?" Elsa smiled faintly, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "They will," she said. "Because they know we're still hungry." By early May, the war in Europe was days from ending, though no one in the ruined towns of Bavaria yet dared to believe it. Rumors traveled faster than orders. Hitler was dead, Berlin surrounded, and the Allies had split Germany in two. But for those still clawing through the rubble, the end of war didn't mean the end of hunger. The fields were still burned, the cattle long slaughtered, and food existed only where the Americans came. What had begun as a few random acts of compassion was now becoming something larger, a quiet rebellion against vengeance. Soldiers who had crossed oceans to destroy an enemy now found themselves trying to feed one. In a farmhouse near the village, Corporal Hayes wrote his report by lantern light. His handwriting trembled with exhaustion. "Our men keep giving away their rations," he wrote. Our men keep giving away their rations," he wrote. "They're not following orders, but I can't stop them. You can't watch a child starve while you're eating beans." The ink smudged as he closed the book. On the table beside him lay Elsa's chocolate wrapper, flattened between two pages like a pressed flower. Outside, dawn broke over the valley. The soldiers had returned once more, officially this time, as part of a relief unit. They had trucks loaded with rations, blankets, and Red Cross parcels. Yet the Army's new instructions were clear. Food distribution must follow procedure. No handouts without record. No private exchanges. But in the field, rules bent like twigs. Lieutenant Carver, the officer in charge, tried to keep order. "This isn't charity," he reminded his men. "We're stabilizing occupied territory." His voice carried authority, but beneath it was a weariness that even command couldn't disguise. He had seen too many villages like this one, children with hair turned gray from malnutrition, mothers too weak to stand. And still, the headquarters in Munich sent memos about discipline. No fraternization, they warned. No emotional involvement. Carver folded the memo into his pocket and went outside, where a dozen women were already waiting with empty pots. Klein, the translator, greeted them first. He'd grown thinner too, his uniform hanging loose from long days and skipped meals. "One at a time, Bit," he said softly. He began taking names for the records, though many of the villagers had forgotten how to sign them. Some simply drew crosses. Behind him, The soldiers opened the crate. The smell of food, canned meat, flour, coffee, filled the square like incense. Lotte was among the first in line, her daughter clutching her skirt. She watched the men unload the boxes, her eyes darting from face to face, searching for Hayes. When she finally saw him at the far end, stacking tins with quiet focus, she felt something strange stir inside, a blend of gratitude and ache. She wanted to thank him for saving her child, but words felt too small for what gratitude had become. As rations were handed out, the tension between policy and conscience became impossible to ignore. Some soldiers followed orders strictly, weighing every portion. Others slipped extra cans into the baskets when no one was looking. Klein noticed but said nothing. "War makes men cruel," he muttered under his breath. "But mercy, mercy makes them human again." In the evenings, the Americans camped just outside town. They set up makeshift kitchens, cooking the same food they distributed. And every night, small shadows appeared at the edges of the firelight, children watching silently, drawn by the smell. The soldiers began inviting them closer. They'd share coffee diluted with milk, or break biscuits into pieces small enough for tiny hands. One evening, Elsa sat beside the fire, her hair catching the orange glow. She spoke little English, but she'd learned one phrase perfectly. "More, please." The men laughed every time she said it, though none of them could look her in the eyes for long. Carver wrote to his wife in Georgia that week. "I thought I'd hate these people. Turns out, I hate what war did to them instead. Our boys don't talk much anymore. They feed strangers and go quiet." He folded the letter carefully and stared at the horizon where artillery flashes still faintly bloomed. The war wasn't over yet, but he knew its spirit had already changed. Days turned into weeks. The Americans began coordinating with Red Cross officials and newly formed local councils. Food trucks came daily. Milk depots were set up for children. Yet alongside this relief came a question none of them could escape. How much compassion was too much? Some commanders feared pity would blur the line between victor and vanquished. "We can't rebuild the same people who tried to burn the world," one officer said. "They need to remember what they caused." Hayes overheard and said nothing, though the words burned in him all night. When he looked at Elsa sleeping under her mother's arm, her ribs still faintly visible beneath the blanket, he knew memory was punishment enough. By mid-May, a new rumor spread through the countryside. The Americans were building feeding stations for children only. Every morning, lines of them formed, hundreds of small faces, some carrying bowls, others just open hands. The soldiers had nicknames for them, the children of the rubble. Some brought flowers as thanks, plucked from the few surviving gardens. Others simply smiled and disappeared after eating, returning the next day as if summoned by fate. A Red Cross photographer visited the village that week. He captured a shot that would later appear in newspapers back home. A young GI crouched beside a girl, handing her a can of milk powder. The caption read, "Feeding the enemy." Yet for those who were there, it didn't feel like an act of charity, it felt like redemption. Hayes saw the photo later and wrote on the back, "She wasn't the enemy. Just hungry." Lotte had begun volunteering, helping distribute food to neighboring towns. Her strength returned, her cheeks no longer hollow. The Americans trusted her, especially Klein, who relied on her to organize the lines. One afternoon, while unpacking a crate, she found a note tucked inside, a slip of paper scrawled in English and translated into German. "This food is sent not in anger, but in hope. May it heal what war broke." No one knew who had written it. The handwriting was young, uncertain, like a soldier's. Lotte folded it carefully into her apron pocket, unsure why it made her want to cry. But even mercy carried shadows. That same night, the villagers heard distant gunfire, rogue SS men refusing to surrender. Rogue SS men refusing to surrender. The Americans went tense. Rifles came out again. Hayes took position at the road, watching the darkness. "Just when you start to think it's over," he whispered, "the war reminds you it never really leaves." The gunfire faded by dawn, leaving only the echo of fear behind. When morning came, the children still lined up as always. Hayes returned to his post at the distribution table. He glanced up once and saw Lotte watching him from across the square. She raised her hand slightly, not in farewell this time, but in quiet understanding. Between them, the space once filled with fear had turned into something else, an unspoken alliance of survivors. Later that evening, as the last rations were handed out, a jeep arrived from headquarters bearing new orders. The relief team was being reassigned north, toward Munich. Carver read the notice aloud, his voice low. The men groaned. The villagers fell silent. Hayes looked at Elsa playing near the fountain, her laughter echoing through the square. He wanted to tell her they'd be back soon, but in war, promises were the one thing no one could afford. As the sun sank behind the broken church steeple, Hayes slipped the chocolate wrapper into his journal again, now creased and faded from handling. He closed the cover gently. "If kindness can survive here," he said quietly to Klein, "maybe everything else can too." Klein didn't answer. He only nodded toward the road where the convoy would leave at dawn, the same road that led to the next town, the next hungry faces, the next chance to prove that mercy could still outlast hate. The convoy left at dawn under a pale sky, the trucks rolling through mist that hung low over the valley. Their tires pressed into the mud that had once been snow, carving trails that glistened like veins in the waking light. Lotte stood beside the church ruins with Elsa in her arms, watching the soldiers fade into distance. No gunfire followed them this time, only the echo of engines and the soft rustle of a country relearning silence. For a long time after they vanished, no one moved. Then the women turned back toward their empty homes, each carrying the same quiet realization. The men who had fed them were gone, but the feeling they left behind had changed something that hunger could never touch. In the days that followed, the Americans did not return. Rations dwindled. The Red Cross sent word that formal relief would come soon, but bureaucracy moved slower than hunger. Still, Lotte refused to despair. She began organizing the mothers, using leftover tins to collect rainwater and trading sewing work for bits of flour. The villagers shared what they had, and when that failed, they shared stories instead, about the strangers in green uniforms who had arrived with food instead of rifles. "The enemy fed us," one woman whispered. "Maybe that means we're allowed to live again." Across the valley, the Americans drove north, toward Munich. Hayes sat in the back of the lead truck, his journal on his lap. He flipped through its pages, pausing on his lap. He flipped through its pages, pausing on the photo the Red Cross man had taken, the one of him crouched beside Elsa. He traced her outline with a gloved thumb, thinking of her laughter around the fire, her fragile courage. The war had taken so much from him. Friends, innocence, the clean certainty of right and wrong, but somehow that child's smile had returned a piece of his soul he didn't know he'd lost. "You ever think about going back?" Klein asked from beside him. Hayes didn't answer at first. He closed the book, staring out at the endless ruins rolling past. "Yeah," he said softly. "Every mile." By mid-May, Germany had surrendered. Across Europe, church bells that had been silent for years rang again. In Nuremberg, civilians gathered in the streets not to celebrate, but simply to listen. Peace felt fragile, like glass still warm from the forge. Soldiers began packing to go home. Carver's men were among them, but their departure came with new orders. Before returning stateside, they were to assist in humanitarian efforts for the displaced. The same men who had carried rifles through Anzio and Dachau now carried crates of baby formula and powdered eggs. "Funny," one of them muttered, "we came to win a war, and now we're learning how to save the world instead." Back in the village, the sound of trucks returned one morning, not military green, but white with the emblem of the Red Cross. This time, the supplies were official, the mission sanctioned. But when the crates were opened, among the standard relief packages lay smaller boxes stamped U.S. Army 45th Infantry. Inside were handwritten notes and familiar tins. Someone, No one could say who had sent them back. One of the notes, folded in half and slipped into a ration box, read simply, "For the little girl with the bright hair and the brave mother. From the boys who never forgot." Lotte held the note for a long time before showing it to anyone. She didn't need to ask who it was from. That night, as the village feasted on stew made from real meat for the first time in years, she told Elsa stories about the soldiers. The kind who fought not with bullets but with bread. Elsa listened wide-eyed, her face glowing in the firelight. "Were they angels?" she asked. Lotte smiled faintly. "No," she said. "Just men who remembered how to be human." Meanwhile, Hayes's unit was stationed near Munich, distributing aid to camps filled with displaced civilians. Each face looked different, but the story was always the same: hunger, loss, and disbelief that anyone could still be kind. He had stopped counting how many bowls of soup he had handed out, but one morning, while sorting mail for the men, a letter caught his eye. It was addressed to the American soldier who gave the chocolate. The handwriting was awkward, the words in careful English. "We are alive. The people are kind again. My mama says you should not feel sad for us. We remember you." There was no signature, only a small drawing of a horse beneath the words. Hayes stared at it for a long time before folding it into his pocket. Weeks passed. The soldiers grew folding it into his pocket. Weeks passed. The soldiers grew restless, half dreaming of home yet uncertain what waited there. The war had changed them too deeply to fit easily back into normal lives. Carver once joked that they'd go home heroes but feel like ghosts. One night, over a shared bottle of coffee and whiskey, Klein said, "You know, compassion's a strange victory. It doesn't win parades, but maybe it lasts longer." Hayes nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah," he murmured, "longer than hate at least." By summer, American relief had transformed the region. Feeding stations became schools. The same children who once lined up for food now learned English words. Hello, thank you, peace. Some soldiers stayed behind to help rebuild roads and farms. Others wrote letters to families they'd met. A few even returned years later to marry women who once called them enemies. It wasn't forgiveness, it was something quieter, sturdier, understanding. For Lotte, the village slowly returned to life. The fields grew green again, the church bell was repaired, and laughter began to echo down streets that had forgotten joy. Yet every morning she looked toward the road where the soldiers had vanished, as if expecting them to reappear. One evening, while cleaning the cupboard, she found the note again and placed it beside the toy horse Elsa had carved from firewood. "We owe them our spring," she whispered. Years later, long after the war, a photograph would surface in an American archive. It showed a woman and a little girl standing beside a rebuilt well, sunlight spilling across their faces. The caption read, "Bavaria, 1945, Villagers after U.S. relief." But in the soldier's handwriting on the back, another note was added: "The day compassion won the war." No one knew who wrote it, though the ink matched that of an old field medic named Hayes, who never stopped telling people that the war's greatest victory wasn't on a battlefield, it was in a broken village where a starving child learned to smile again. As twilight descended over Bavaria that summer, the hills no longer echoed with fear. Farmers tilled the soil, church bells rang, and children chased one another through fields reborn from ash. The memory of those green trucks lingered like a benediction, proof that even in the ruins of hate, humanity could still take root. Lotte would sometimes tell Elsa, "You must remember this, not the bombs, not the hunger, but the kindness. Because one day someone will need to hear that mercy doesn't end when wars do." Far away, on the deck of a transport ship crossing the Atlantic, Hayes watched the fading coast of Europe. In his journal, he wrote one final line beneath the flattened chocolate wrapper: "We left with empty packs but full hearts. If that's not victory, I don't know what is." He closed the book, slipped it into his duffel, and looked toward the horizon glowing with sunrise. Somewhere behind him, the people he once called enemies were learning to live again, and somewhere ahead, a world was learning what victory truly meant.